Good evening. Thanks so much for coming. My name's Tim Lustig. I'm head of the School of Humanities. And it's my great pleasure tonight to welcome you to a public lecture by Professor Alex Sharpe. Alex is an internationally renowned social and legal theorist, legal historian, and gender, sexuality, and law scholar and activist. She's been writing about gender, sexuality, and law issues generally, and transgender law issues specifically for over 20 years. Her extensive publication list includes 3 monographs: Transgender Jurisprudence, 2002, Foucault's Monsters and the Challenge of Law, 2010, and most recently forthcoming from Routledge, order your copies now, Gender Identity Fraud, Reframing a Legal and Ethical Debate. And it's the theme of the outsider that connects Alex's various academic projects and political interventions. Her body of work, in fact, can be thought of as a kind of outsider jurisprudence. This evening she will talk about the ultimate outsider, the monster, a figure she sees as hopeful and which she will bring to life through the sublime David Bowie. Alex, thank you very much.
Welcome to the lecture. Before I begin, I would just like to say a few thank yous. First, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for having the intellect and the obvious taste to be in attendance this evening. I'd also like to thank Tim Lustig, head of the Humanities School, for organising this event and for his enthusiasm in that regard, and for hosting it under the banner of humanities, where I think it perhaps most properly belongs. I'd also like to thank Dominic Janes for agreeing very graciously to act as discussant later when we'll have a brief conversation and before we involve you, the audience, with comments and questions that you may have. I'd also like to thank Kerry Jones, who's done a lot of the publicity work for this event, and I think her efforts are clear to see this evening, so thank you, Kerry. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Dan Harvey, who's actually up there. Nobody can see him in a little room. I can see him. He's waving, but you can't see. He's one of our audio-visual wizards at Keele, and he's really helped with embedding tunes in this PowerPoint, which has been great. And I've learned a whole new skill set in the process, which is also fabulous. So thank you to all of those people very much. So let me turn to scary monsters. Pardon me. Let me begin with what all right-minded people know. David Bowie was special. More than special, otherworldly. A starman who came to deliver us from the emptiness, the dreariness, the heteronormative fetters of English suburban life. However, attempts, especially after his death, to canonize or deify him are misplaced. Because he wasn't a saint or a god, not even a rock god. Gasp. He was so much more than that. He was a monster, and what a monster he was. And it is monsters, not gods, who point the way, artistically, ethically, spiritually. This lecture is about 3 things: monsters, hope, and David Bowie. Monsters because the monster is the outsider template par excellence. Hope, because monsters are quintessentially hopeful. Bowie, because he is the monster writ large. Of all the figures within popular culture, few embody the monster quite like David Bowie. Monsters, then, will be our object. Hope, our reason, and Bowie, our guide and delight. Through Bowie, we will journey through the territory of sex, gender, and sexuality, human, animal, hybridity, and the sacred and profane. And in the process, we will consider some key categorical distinctions which the monster brings to crises. I begin with Sweet Thing, taken from Bowie's 1974 album, Diamond Dogs.
It's safe in the city to love in a dull way, to wrangle some screams from the door. And isn't it neat, putting pain in a stranger, like a portrait in flesh, or trails on a leash? Will you see?
Sweet Thing is one of my favourite Bowie songs. I love the melancholic mood, the sensitive way it explores isolation and loneliness through an imagined, perhaps real, encounter with an older sex worker. At first, it seems like an emotionless fuck, as Bowie puts pain in a stranger. But as the song develops, so does tenderness. Crucially, the song produces longing through musical tone and lyrical opacity. It produces an awareness that all in the world is not in sync with the self. In such moments, our out-of-kilter selves sense something more, something different, something richer. It is the arousal of this feeling which helps explain why our relationship to Bowie is one of such deep resonance. As Simon Critchley puts it, Bowie's music is a discord with the world that can allow a certain de-mundanization, a withdrawal that might permit us to see things in a utopian light. In other words, there is something hopeful about David Bowie. And hope is something that connects him to the monster. Though, as we shall see, it is not the only thing. Before turning to Bowie, however, I will first present a framework for thinking about the structure of the monster. The monster is both a legal category and a contemporary template within social theory, through which the production and regulation of outsiders, especially those most threatening to the social and legal order, might best be comprehended. The category of the monster first entered English law through Bracton and the partial reception of Roman law in the mid-13th century, and persisted in one incarnation or other through Coke and Blackstone and beyond, at least into the 19th century. At the core of English legal understandings of the monster lay the Roman law distinction between monstrosity and deformity, whereby the latter set the limits to what counted as human. In other words, the deformity side of the distinction served to highlight corporeal forms of human difference that law proved able to accommodate. In articulating a monster framework, I will draw in particular on the work of Michel Foucault and Georges Canguilhem. Canguilhem essentially adopts a Roman law understanding of the monster with its fixation on bodies. We will see that Foucault moves beyond this understanding in order to extend the concept of the monster to include the psyche. However, the lecture will also tease out what Foucault and Canguilhem neglect, that is, the monster's intrinsic hopefulness. In laying this theoretical ground, and in order to clarify my position, I will provide some examples of monsters that might have been covered in this lecture as alternatives to Bowie, and some examples that ought not to be treated as monsters at all. In proceeding in this way, I aim to delineate the proper object of our inquiry, for not all scary creatures are monsters. In choosing a monster topic, there are many directions one could take. Thus, I could have discussed physical monsters of the past, ones that have preoccupied us since antiquity. This would be a story of how science has sought to kill off monsters, or at least our belief in them. Such a history would include consideration of the social and legal treatment of bestial humans, conjoined twins, and hermaphrodites, three figures which, according to Foucault, preoccupied the West during the late Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Classical period, respectively. Alternatively, I could focus on science as the creator rather than the destroyer of monsters. One contemporary example that might be explored here is the creation of human-animal admixed embryos. Or perhaps we might venture beyond reality into the territory of fiction, if to invoke the monster is not already to have made that journey. Thus, we might consider werewolves, vampires, the creature in Frankenstein, or perhaps Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, or Marvel Comics' The Incredible Hulk. In choosing these examples of fiction, I have deliberately avoided King Kong, Godzilla, and Cookie Monster. The reason for such exclusions is that I want to distinguish between monsters on the one hand and beasts or creatures on the other. While some scholars might want to define monsters more broadly, I think a key thing about monsters is that they are at least part human, though never completely so. That is, hybridity is a condition of their constitution, but not any kind of hybridity. It is for this reason that Dolly the sheep fails to make the cut. For Canguilhem, the monster presupposes departure or deviation from some morphological norm. This can be thought of in terms of physical lack or, more often, excess. It is, therefore, at least for Canguilhem, a high degree of physical human difference that leads to a conclusion of monstrosity. However, monstrosity alone is insufficient to produce the monster. The element of monstrousness is also required. By monstrousness, Canguilhem is pointing to a requirement that a body contravene or transgress law. Thus, Canguilhem's monster is to be understood as the effect of a particular law-nature nexus. It arrives in the world when there is a breach of nature, understood as morphological irregularity, and a simultaneous breach of law, understood as a crisis of classification. Foucault understands the monster in similar terms. As he points out, it appears only when the confusion of nature comes up against, overturns, or disturbs law. Thus, for Foucault, like Canguilhem, the monster is not simply an outlaw. It not only refuses and escapes the law, it renders it unintelligible. However, Foucault reworked the idea of a breach of nature to take account of the historical shift in the regulatory preoccupations of the state from the body to the soul or psyche. This reworking is important because it enables the idea of the monster to extend beyond the physical body to include a truly modern figure, the monster within. Thus, while Canguilhem took the view that the natural sciences had killed off monsters, Foucault points to the social sciences as spawning, in the mid to late 19th century, a multiplicity of new, albeit diluted, monsters, which of course he termed abnormal individuals. It is then this idea of the monster as a human, non-human hybrid, existing in nature but confounding law, that I want to take up. This is because it is this understanding of monster, whether understood in terms of the body and or the psyche, that produces in us the greatest anxiety. And what produces the greatest anxiety is the simultaneous distance and proximity we bear to monsters. In one sense, they prop us up through creating the fantasy of stable ground beneath our feet. They do this through providing an outside to our human outline. But we can never keep them at arm's length. We are full of doubts. Wherever we draw the line, monsters highlight permeability. Having made these preliminary remarks and moving ever closer to Bowie, as I'm sure some people will be relieved to hear, but before proceeding to Bowie, I want to say something about hope, about the hopefulness of monsters. Foucault and Canguilhem provide us with a structure for understanding how monsters appear and how they fade away. They say little, if anything, about their hopefulness. It might seem counterintuitive to think of monsters as hopeful. After all, monsters, both of the flesh as well as those within literature and popular culture, have often been imagined and portrayed as portents of dystopia, as figures that lie in wait over the horizon. Yet they have also been viewed as hopeful signs. Certainly, after the 5th century writings of St. Augustine, monsters were read increasingly as signs of the power and glory of God to come. In any event, monsters are intrinsically hopeful for at least 2 reasons. First, they guarantee us a tomorrow. Second, they point to the place of the sacred in a world without God. Let me explain. In relation to ensuring a future, Derrida reminds us that the future is necessarily monstrous. The figure of the future, that is, that which can only be surprising, that for which we are not prepared, is heralded by species of monsters. A future that would not be monstrous would not be a future. It would already be a predictable, calculable, and programmable tomorrow. Turning to the place of the sacred, monsters point to it. Whatever else it might be, the sacred is that which holds value. In Leibnizian terms, as Desmond Manderson notes, what gives something value is its inability to be adequately reduced to our own pre-existing terms. Value is what is left over when our efforts to know, define, and to commodify have been exhausted. It is precisely the monster's irreducibility to human or non-human that gives it value, and that speaks to each of us and to our collective parts. In contrast to commodification, they call for solidarity, connection, and love. While transgression may provide access to the sacred, as Bataille contends, and while monsters are, on such an account, necessarily its stormtroopers, love is its content, or at least a content I wish to emphasize. While religion claims the sacred as its own, I am identifying love rather than myth as a source of the sacred to which the monster points. And so we ought to embrace monsters. By embrace, I mean not only the differences that mark others and lie within ourselves, but also what the monster concept represents more broadly: change, ambiguity, instability, complexity, openness. Because we want a future, and because we want both to love and to be loved, embrace the monster we must. Having placed the monster within a theoretical frame, and having emphasized its intrinsic hopefulness, I now turn to the vehicle for the lecture, the countercultural icon, autodidact, sublime anti-hero and provocateur, David Bowie. I have selected Bowie for 3 reasons. First, I like Bowie. Second, and while Bowie is so much more than the music, an example from the world of music is instructive because music is, as Jacques Attali contends, prophecy. It makes audible the new world that will gradually become visible. Or as Bowie has put it, tomorrow belongs to those who hear it coming. In this sense, music, much like the monster, heralds the future. Third, and most importantly for our purposes, Bowie, perhaps more than any other figure within popular culture, captures the idea and the promise of the monster. According to Devereux, Delane, and Power, there has never been an artist as intellectually, musically, and visually compelling as David Bowie. How true. But the reasons why Bowie is so compelling are inextricably tied up with the fact that he is the daddy-o of late 20th century monsters of popular culture and the mother of others, as well as those to come. Who better than Bowie to exemplify the monster? Bowie, a figure who, due to a dilated left pupil, had the appearance of being an alien before he even got going, and who would later play that role in film. Nick Rogue's The Man Who Fell to Earth. In television, Bertolt Brecht's Bâle on the BBC. And theatre, The Elephant Man on Broadway. Bowie, who had stated, "I always had a repulsive need to be something more than human." So, with an eye to the promise of monsters, let us turn to this outre figure extraordinaire. I will focus on the period 1969 to 1980, what might be described as Bowie's golden years. However, in privileging this period, I do not mean to reduce his subsequent work to mere retrospective, something which the music press did endlessly after 1980. Bowie cannot be frozen in time. Like the monster he embodied, a recognition of transience guided everything he did.
Scary monsters, super creeps, keep me running scared.
In this part of the chorus to his 1980 song, Scary Monsters, Super Creeps, Bowie alludes to at least three things that are central to thinking about monsters. One, monsters can scare the shit out of us, and two, we like it. Or, to put it another way, the monster is an amalgam of fear and desire. We look away, but we always look back. We are spellbound, transfixed, or as Bowie puts it,
You can't say no to the beauty and the beast.
and the reason for this is that there is something tantalizing about monsters. They are strange, awesome in fact, yet strangely familiar. This produces in us a sense of the uncanny. Third, through the encounter, monsters, as Bowie says, keep us running. They urge us forward into the unknown. They call us to be greater than we are, to move beyond ourselves, our current predicament, our trivialities. In this sense, monsters, while perhaps terrifying, represent hope. They promise a new dawn. Unlike most artists, and especially rock stars, who tend to subject us to an endless repetition of the same, Bowie, himself a fiction destined to become more real than his creator, invented and inhabited a series of personas, each with its own aesthetic and musical particularity. Moreover, he always insisted, usually in the very moment of musical and artistic triumph, on killing off objects of fan love. While other rock stars, like The Who's Pete Townshend, confined auto-destructive art to smashing up guitars on stage, Bowie, with much less fanfare, always turned it on himself. That is, he committed serial ritual suicide. Like a Gustav Metzger acid painting, Bowie dissolved before our eyes, only to be reconstituted elsewhere. To be a Bowie fan, then, was to mourn, to let go, and to learn to love again, and to become aware that this process would be repeated without end, or at least till the end, by which time, of course, it had inspired countless new beginnings. That is, Bowie would spawn a monstrous progeny, artistically, musically, culturally. The journey would be painful, but as Bowie himself pointed out, it would never be dull. Having soaked up art's filthy lesson, he refused to present himself other than through the guise of the mask. As a child of William Burroughs and Andy Warhol, Bowie attended to surface, not depth. Not depth.
Andy Warhol, silver screen, can't tell them apart at all.
Preferring Burroughs' cut-up technique and Brian Eno's planned accidents to a false and limiting authenticity that had so dogged rock in the 60s, he moved relentlessly from illusion to illusion, though always got closer to reality, to a felt corporeal truth, than those who accused him of fakery. Bowie's direction, then, was one of continual reinvention, death, and rebirth, a kind of protean creature who gestured toward the monster at every turn. And yet, Bowie's gaze was not unproblematically forward. He always looked back in the sense of an internal dialogue.
Do you remember a guy that's been in such another song?
Bowie would continue, if infrequently, to check in on Major Tom, and he appears for the final time in the video for the song Black Star, where his death coincides with Bowie's own. In this sense, Bowie understood identity as shifting and complex, but also the importance of pathos, the need to attend to earlier selves. In terms of his artistic presentations and developing aesthetic, he exchanged the alien messiah and proto-punk Ziggy for the paranoid and corrupted Aladdin Sane, only to morph into Halloween Jack, a dystopian figure who ushered in the year of the Diamond Dogs. This ain't rock and roll, this is genocide. Who in turn succumbed to the plastic soul boy of young Americans, only to be sacrificed on the slab of the emotionally distant thin white Jew. An Uberman character who gestured aesthetically toward German modernism and the avant-garde. And finally, to Pierrot, the tragi-comic fool clown of Scary Monsters. In other words, throughout the 70s, and with corpses piling up behind him, Bowie's dance went on and on and on.
Turn and face the strange changes.
In other words, Bowie understood what is true in art as it is in life. Stasis equals death. In refusing the tyranny of fixed identity, as well as the purity of genre, Bowie, like the monster he so eloquently symbolized and embodied, made possible, ushered in, the new. However, Bowie aimed not merely to change, he was not simply a chameleon. Rather, he always sought to fuck things up. That is, he was not concerned only with motion, but with challenging the taken for granted, the axiomatic, the self-evident. As he stated in 1998, once something is categorized and accepted, it becomes part of the tyranny of the mainstream, and it loses all potency. Like Foucault, he seemed to understand such an approach to be absolutely necessary as a ground-clearing exercise. No respecter of tradition, his MO was perpetual reinvention, or as Bowie has characterized it, perhaps with an emphasis on mischief, hit and run. And in his creative endeavors, Bowie was monster-like, both in the sense of being incredibly prolific, gargantuan, and in his promiscuity, his mixing of genres. Indeed, Bowie's originality lies precisely in this practice. He embraced derivation. Or we might say he liked to borrow, or perhaps, given Picasso's distinction between talent and genius, steal. He liked to steal, and he liked to mix. In the face of musical and other artistic genres, Bowie was incapable of fidelity. In terms of music, he flirted with folk and the whimsy of English music hall. Think Anthony Newley and Lionel Bart. Then looked to Black America, rock and roll, soul, funk, before turning to the minimalism and discordant notes of krautrock, announcing the European canon is here. The Berlin years ended with the album Lodger. Bowie could never stick around for long. In terms of imagery, he moved through mod, hippie, a period as a mime, androgynous space invader, amoral aristocrat, clown, and so forth. As both monsters and artists do, he pointed to some of our deepest anxieties concerning sex, gender, and sexuality, human, animal, hybridity, and the relationship between the human and the divine, or at least between the sacred and profane. And in the main, he did so, not through denunciation or the satirizing of social norms, the fuck you of punk and oppositional politics, but, and more gently, through parody, holding up, through his characters and lyrics, absurdist mirrors that serve to suspend the world, at least temporarily. And in these moments, these wonderful moments, he enabled us to see things, and of course ourselves, anew, more keenly, and to glimpse, as Richard Fitch observes, the reality that ambivalence trumps moral and political certainties. In relation to gender, Bowie struck an androgynous pose. On the original The Man Who Sold the World album cover, we see Bowie reclining on a chaise lounge in full pre-Raphaelite transvestic splendor. On Hunky Dory, we see his likeness to Dietrich, or perhaps Greta Garbo. With the arrival of Ziggy and Aladdin Sane, his androgyny morphed into more highly sexualized camp. Think Jean Genet or Jean Genet. As Judith Priano notes, Bowie's gender undecidability can be contrasted with the prevailing masculinist subculture that dominated British rock in the mid to late 1960s. While
Ziggy played guitar,
Bowie rarely did. In opposition to the cock rock of the period and the compulsory heterosexuality to which it spoke, Bowie inserted the feminine, but not in a shy way. Through fakery, he highlighted the artificiality of rock, but also the constructedness of gender. Later, and inspired by the Berlin drag scene, he would challenge male privilege and heteronormativity through the classic song and video, Boys Keep Swinging.
Heaven loves you. The clouds part for you. Nothing stands in your way when you're a boy.
In relation to sexuality, and at a time when homophobia remained pervasive, both in the US and the UK, Bowie, though married to Angie, came out as gay. The first really major star to just come right out and say it.
he played it left hand.
A reference perhaps to Hendrix, but also to homosexual inclination. Later, he repositioned as bi, then as a closet heterosexual. Moreover, during his travels across the hetero-homo divide, and perhaps beyond it, Bowie's object choices transcended cis sexuality. That is, during his Berlin period, Bowie had a lengthy relationship with muse and famous transgender cabaret star Romy Haag. Ultimately, when asked the sexual identity question, Bowie expressed only boredom, yawn. Moreover, he openly shunned gay politics. He did not want to lead a movement. As Michael Watts has noted, Bowie despised tribal qualities. In this respect, he was more like Oscar Wilde than Andre Gide. That is, more queer than gay, or bi, or not, exactly. Bowie's refusal of fixed sexual identity produces a crisis of classification. In contrast to the relatively muted threat posed by homosexuality, which, after all, serves to bolster heterosexuality as abnormal mirror image, a queer sensibility throws the cat among the pigeons. In Foucault's terms, Bowie's fleshy and interior sexual monstrosity align with monstrousness. In terms of Bowie's sexual playfulness, we can situate him on both sides of Noel Carroll's distinction for conceptualizing monsters, namely fusion and fission. Fusion refers to mixture in point of time, whereas fission refers to the occupation of the body by different entities at different times. Thus, we might contrast the mythic figure of the Minotaur, fusion, with Jekyll and Hyde, or the incredible Hulk, fission. However, drawing on Foucault, and thereby shifting the focus from the body to the soul or psyche, we might recognize Bowie's bisexual fusion, while at the same time recognizing fission, that is, his apparent shift from gay to straight, or albeit closeted. Ultimately, Bowie eludes the distinction, refusing to take a position in a move that is both queer and pre-queer. As Bowie himself might put it,
So I turn myself to face me, but I've never caught a glimpse how the others must see the faker. I'm much too fast to take that test.
turning to human-animal hybridity, on the Diamond Dogs album cover, Bowie appears as half man, half dog. The original version this original version, shows full genitalia, but was later airbrushed for mass release. The airbrushed version, however, served only to neuter the creature, thereby producing a crisis of sex as well as species. The image is striking. While the two human, perhaps demonic bitches that squat behind Bowie might be described as grotesque, it is more difficult to characterize Bowie in this way. Certainly, his intense, fixed gaze, his knowingness, is unlikely to elicit pity. Rather, he appears powerful and defiant, delighting in the celebration of hybridity, in being one of the strangest living curiosities, as the accompanying text declares. If there is disgust, there is also recognition and desire. We are never far from animality, despite the best efforts of the superego. Nevertheless, the image on the Diamond Dogs cover points to a, perhaps the, central taboo in Western culture. Thou shalt not mix species, which of course is a prohibition against bestiality. This image is provocative, however, not primarily because of bestial possibilities, but because it serves to remind us of our inability to distinguish between human and animal, and because it points to our own animality, and therefore perhaps the possibility of unknown pleasures. The human-animal hybrid is a powerful monster archetype, one that has preoccupied us since antiquity. The distinction between human and animal has been important in defining the contours of humanity, in rendering us human. Yet anxiety concerning the distinction is long-standing. Certainly, by the end of the 18th century, the human-animal distinction was under enormous pressure from the scientific community. And as Donna Haraway notes, by the end of the 20th century, the boundary between human and animal was thoroughly breached. The specialness of Homo sapiens at the biological level has become even more suspect since the findings of the Human Genome Project, which push an already fragile idea of human close to breaking point. And yet, in the face of this crisis of the human, we should not be alarmed. The human was always already a construct that not only divided us from other species, but from each other and from ourselves. In other words, behind the lie of ontological purity, whose logical end is always disturbing and sometimes leads to the death camp, lies the beautiful truth of hybridity, of the monster. Metaphorically and artistically, Bowie points the way. In the face of taboo, the royal no, he always seemed to say yes. Yes to difference. Yes to mixture. Yes to connection. As Simon Critchley notes, what Bowie seemed to offer was an absolute and unconditional affirmation of life in all of its chaotic complexity, but also its moments of transport and delight. And after all, if we can embrace the hybrid, the monster, the most reviled of creatures, do we not guarantee the livability of and create pleasurable possibilities for every life? And so to my final theme concerning Bowie and monsters, distinguishing between the human and the divine. or at least between the sacred and profane. While religious themes run through Bowie's lyrics, the 14 stations of the Christian cross, the journey from Kepha to Malkuth of the Jewish Kabbalah, etc., 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 Bowie had no time for organised religion. As he said,
"You can't stick your lives on a saviour machine."
However, spirituality, in some sense, informs much of his work, searching for some kind of meta-connection. As Critchley observes, Bowie's obsession with and opposition to the church appears to be founded on the view that it has fraudulently co-opted, branded, marketed, and moralized the experience of transcendence. In Berlin in 2002, on the Heathen tour, Bowie introduced the song Heathen with the following heartfelt plea.
God bless us. Please, God bless us.
Of course, he was not literally referring to a god. Rather, he was speaking to outsiders with whom he identified and who identify with him, and expressing the hope that we are not heathen. By heathen, he is referring both to the substitution of the God who has died with ourselves and to the embrace of the ordinary or banal. Thus, Bowie's heathen is hubristic, but also materially consumptive and happiness directed. In musical terms, think Coldplay or the dreadful, dreadful Bono. In the face of such profanity, Bowie yearns for connection, for love, and ultimately for the sacred.
Ain't there one dance song that can make me break down and cry?
And of course, we yearn with him. Bowie always strikes this chord. What stands in the way, apart from human arrogance, are accrued social meanings, tradition, fixed identities. It is as if, like Nietzsche and more recently Foucault, Bowie seeks to throw off the weight of history. Certainly, he sought to undo the self, to pare it back. In doing so, he negates the fantasy of ontological purity, a fantasy that divides us from ourselves and others. This fantasy must be destroyed in order that the monster might live, and so that we might be free in the Foucauldian sense, that is, to be otherwise. In preference to the default position of all too human, man is an obstacle, sad as the clown, the monster and Bowie as monster provide a bridge between where we are now and where or who we would like to be. Ultimately, the monster points to transcendence of self and to communion with others, to the creation of spaces large enough for love to enter. To conclude then, Bowie, both in flesh and as a series of artistic and musical representations, can be viewed as occupying, nay celebrating, the position of the monster. In contrast to the certainty of law, he offers undecidability, ambiguity, hybridity, impurity, metamorphosis. In relation to nature, he introduces and celebrates bodily and psychic irregularity. He is a creature both of and for our postmodern times. So let us embrace monsters, so much better than gods, with their tragic, endless lives. Better to die and be reborn, not a god repetition without end, but
ashes to ash and funk to funk it.
I remember when Elvis died. I know I look younger. It was kind of sad, but I didn't cry. It was the same with John Lennon 3 years later, and countless others since. But on the 10th of January last year, I did cry, cried quite a lot. Partly because Bowie was the soundtrack to much of my life, especially my youth. But to foreground nostalgia would be to misrepresent the experience and its temporality. For in mourning Bowie's passing, the sense of loss is palpable, as it must be when a true monster dies. What we feel, we who are not heathen, is not nostalgia for the past, but rather what Bowie has described as nostalgia for the future. That is, a deep longing for connection, for love, and for an experience of the sacred in the here and now and in the future. And yet, even in death, something Bowie styled as he had life, he left us with hope, a parting caress. I refer here to his final album and Requiem, Black Star, released only 2 days before his death, and which instantly went viral. Through the song Lazarus, Bowie points to resurrection, to a return. Of course, there will be no more Bowie, other than in celluloid and forever. But there will be other hopeful monsters. How could it be otherwise? A life without monsters would be unimaginable and unbearable. I leave you with Bowie, pictured here 2 days before he died. And like the monster, the embodiment of vitality, defiance, and hope.